So continuing where I left off before concerning the different modes of corruption, we have to then get to the manners of such. The manners of such are more specific, more imminent, and more well defined in their expression, because they come at and after the resultant evidence of spirit. So the spirit of the act brings into evidence that which from then on is understood to be the manner of the occurrence. And the manner is a more specified form of the mode, but it's also it reflects a different genus as well, simultaneously, of the manifestation of reality as a whole. And it's going to lead to either a cycle which recapitulates its origin, or there will be a diversion from that, representing a usurpation and inversion. So either of these results, and there are complex modes of analysis to determine the various forms of these diversions and conversions back to a convergence of these distributions of energy, which become the fruit, which we call the world. At this point, the event leads to the fruition of a clear demonstration through a properly executed discovery that there is a certain sort of injustice going on, which is so systematic and pervasive that it's to be described as infinitizing of what would have been the case otherwise. So there might have been injustice before, but after the occurrence of this form, it is now infinitized. It is transformed into something that may have an indefinite duration as a result of its ability to systematically create chaos where there should have been order, and to enforce invalid orders where there should have been the freedom miscalled chaos. And so the methods of this are well documented. They've been in existence for a very long time, but you may call them rackets. So we're moving beyond the generic domain of fraud into a specific form of it called racketeering. So not only are sometimes false causes or false events generated in order to create specious forms of human action, manipulable by those involved in the racket, but engagements with these rackets will be subverted anywhere they attempt to discover just causes which will be against them. Just causes which will not be against them are part of the racket itself, in that they appear just in most possible worlds, but can simply be covered for, let's just say, false flag type injustices. They can be real in themselves, but they're actually cover or catalyst for further crimes which are hidden behind them and people's response to them. Problem, reaction, solution scenarios, basically, as has been brought to our attention by various commentators on these sorts of things. Well, the process of that enforces the racket, and so the fuel for the racket, the motive, is produced on an end where that corruption should not be, and then on the end where responsible persons respond to the evidence and are responsible for finding reasons for action, typical people in society, for example, then especially in authority, and then that process is interfered with by the same agents, or even by other agents working in a symbiosis with the aforesaid agents. And you can have dupes filling in that category quite well. Patsies and that sort of thing, victims, basically. Compromised victims. So, for example, in the reaction to evidence, which becomes observation, discretion, inspection, investigation, and discovery. One must process percepts, sensations, figures, images, arrangements, schemes, orders, patterns, reasons, and causes. In order to get one gets from the sensation to the perception, gathering an impression, which leads to an understanding of the image and the figure, which enables a total experience inevitably through the figmentation of a scheme, understanding its causes. We lead to what we understand to be an arrangement. We're discovering the motives and the methods. Experiences and experiments of this sort end up discovering order and pattern, which are further investigated to find out what are the causes and the reasons for these patterns and orders. And that's the discovery of the obvious, because it becomes obvious at that point, and one realizes the chain of causes meant in some intuitive sense it was obvious from the beginning. The ostensible fruit of this is a realization of what is the case based on what caused it, the ratio, and the correspondence between these properly is what justice is. Any deviation from that is injustice by definition. So what ends up happening is a systematic obstruction of justice occurs, and at its maximum we find the opposite of perfect justice, which is perfect injustice. So while there are degrees between the two, there are also extrema, which express the maximum state of either in a given context. You'll find evidence of the perfect injustice through the usurpation and inversion of symbols of authority and accoutrement of their expression. Just as one example. So institutions will be subverted under that paradigm. The occurrence of human action in typical formats and conditions can often occur as usual, with deviations not necessarily directly perceptible in the material evidence, but could be understood to be dislocations of what should have been the proper spirit or the proper essence of the arrangement. But this is symptomatic of an inversion of what should be the case on one level by a usurpation of what is the case on the other. So when the image or the institution of authority, for example, and its authoritativeness is usurped, there is an inversion of the motive of its application behind it in all the offices in which people are practicing, vacuous rituals of authority. Now, the whole reason that I create these templates is because the understanding of reality is partly analog and not digital. And I mean, in logic, this was made plainly evident in the developments in mathematics resulting from a continuous analysis of numbers and their relationships developed by such thinkers as Newton and Leibniz. So it's just a continuation of that same impulse to reciprocate the intuition with some respect for it in the method. As a heuristic system, the applicability will be borne out in the evidence discovered through its application. And I don't see any contradiction to the statement that in this case, the map is topologically congruent with the territory. The problems that result from this reach critical mass, you might say, whenever the domain of phenomena taken to be the status quo, however normative they may be often allowed or still seem to appear, they all act basically as a strategic cover for a kind of extremely vicious and pernicious corruption, so that in fact almost normal occurrences become, in essence, delivery modules for everything undesirable and contrary to their appearance. It simply becomes the result as a result of the integration of the elements that formerly made up whatever the correct arrangement of affairs should have been. So with the understanding that this affects every aspect of the four columns which make up the world, the individual, the role, the group, and the culture, and that the emergent property, the world, is discoverable as the fruit of that development, which I just outlined as a promulgation of reality through essence, mode, and manner back into its origin, so as to discover itself, basically, to reveal itself, to express itself, and therefore share itself with itself. That's how that original divine Godhead operates. There's not this kind of corruption discoverable in that process, but it is discoverable in this world. And fortunately, the process of reality is far bigger than this little bitty world, which is certainly not holy and certainly not sacred. The usurpations and inversions which have taken place, which are preeminently demonstrable today, more than it was yesterday, more than they were yesterday, are fully a just cause and appropriate reason for what's going to happen next, which I keep saying is inevitable, but there will be human action initiated by the inertia of previously occurring events in history and so on. All the typical rackets will defend themselves in all the typical ways until the entire thing is annihilated. That can happen either briefly and with perhaps less suffering in some ways for some, and or in a more prolonged way, but in ways more severe as a result. For sure, for some, because justice delayed is justice denied. Perhaps the worst case scenario would be to attempt to usurp the process of justice by similar mechanisms of control which have made this injustice what it is, which would be the complete usurpation of the guise of virtue and the complete inversion of the spirit of authority, to the contrary of what it pretends, which we've seen. So, no stone unturned. Well, you didn't unturn enough stones because you got some pretty big ones right behind you and to each side of you. And you lacked the manpower or the will in those particular institutions to which I refer obliquely here, or you simply lack the manhood to do what's required to correct those injustices that are right before your very eyes, or you've stood by while those eyes have been blinded by corrupt officials, again, behind or to either side of you. So your corruptions manifest in the destruction of childhood innocence everywhere, in the domain where you supposedly have jurisdiction. Or those apples. I can't take credit for that. So in a belated sort of way, I directly address the matter that the title of that one video I made suggested I would in more detail, which was the issue of Pizzagate. In fact, this is the cause of the existence of the entire question. And it's further intensified by this cause in such a way as to be worse, far worse than people imagine could possibly stomach. So a lot of their ethical and cognitive dissonance can be understood almost as a simple physical compensation of basically the inertia of action and reaction, but at the same time, this condition was allowed and perpetrated by their deference to, their rolling over to, their dupery toward the very corruption that led to these crimes, which are now being discovered. So if one looks at the situation in the full scope of the causes, one can see that yes, it is a horrible thing and should be addressed, and it should be understood that inversions and usurpations of the addressing of the problem will definitely be in play by those who are definitely behind it. And that understood would explain a lot of the propaganda of evasion and distraction, which is concomitant with these discoveries. It's probably another form of the same mechanism which enables the truth to be delivered under the spell of it being fiction, or it being merely a fantasy and not a reality. Psychotronics, which can emulate effects of drugs like scopolamine and other substances, is no doubt at play in dual-purpose facilities for this kind of mind programming, which become pervasive, such as the Wi-Fi system, movie theaters, circumstances in so-called smart cities where events that should have been according to the fate of chance or simply human action unfurling through time are simply now part of a racket of manipulation, subtle and undetectable by most of the dupes involved, although there are accessories and there is blameworthiness all along the spectrum of those involved, because ignorance is not, as anyone who understands the law will tell you, a justification. We're responsible for knowing what we're getting into and acting with due diligence. So ask yourself if you've been acting with due diligence, and whether or not the institutions and those around you and the various groups in which they exist or pretend to exist, ask if they are enacting due diligence